All right, everybody. Today's episode is sponsored by Blind Barrels, a company that offers an exclusive blind whiskey tasting experience. Bob and I tried their product in season 6, and it led directly to this ad because we are such huge fans of what they're doing. If you are interested in sampling the very best in American craft whiskey, then use our code FILM10 at their checkout for 10% off a yearly or quarterly subscription, or even off a single box to try it out. And remember, if you're hunting for rare whiskeys, you can always buy the whiskey you've tried on their website, often at prices cheaper than MSRP. Check them out at blindbarrels.com and use code FILM10 for 10% off on your order. As we get into today's episode, I just want to take a second and remind you that there's a ton of extra content available to the members of Film and Whiskey Nation who support us through our Patreon. Check us out on patreon.com/filmwhiskey.
On today's Film and Whiskey, we are going to be scoring out director Clint Eastwood on 5 metrics to determine just what kind of director he is. While we're doing that, we're going to sip on 4 whiskeys from Virginia Distillery Company, and then we're going to go over to an interview with Brett Boles, who you might know from TikTok or Instagram Reels as the MT. He's a fantastic music teacher who's going to help us break down the music in some of our favorite movies.
This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome into the Film and Whiskey Podcast. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we're coming at you with the first bonus episode of this season.
Bonus episode.
Man, we have gotten through 3 weeks of Clint Eastwood, some of the heaviest and saddest movies we've ever watched for this podcast, back to back to back, Brad.
Yeah, very, very interesting movies. My perspective on Clint has changed a lot in the last few years.
I gotta say, man, putting him under scrutiny as a director, not just as an actor, not just as like a movie star or a figure, but looking at how he directs films, I gotta say, I really, really have a ton of respect for him as an auteur in a way that I probably didn't before this series.
Well, the thing for me that's hard to judge about Clint is that he is so prolific in his directing.
Mm-hmm.
Like he probably has 30 movies to his name.
Oh, yeah, at least. I mean, probably more than that. It's probably closer to 50.
That he's directed?
Oh, yeah.
On top of 50 or 60 that he only acted in, right?
I'm going to look it up. You go ahead and vamp a little bit.
Okay. Well, the reason I bring that up is to say, I went through a lot of his movies on IMDb, and a lot of them have anywhere from like a 5 to a 7 out of 10, which, you know, is not exactly a high score on IMDb.
Not so much.
And so it's interesting to me when I think about most what we would call auteurs, I think about people who only make a small amount of movies. You know what I mean? Like, you think about somebody like Quentin Tarantino. Like, he's like, I'm going to make 10 movies and that's it. And or Terrence Malick, who comes out with a movie every like 37 years.
So yeah, Eastwood has 45 directing credits to his name on IMDb.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's the hard part for me is I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of him by watching, you know, at this point, we watched 3 now. And we're only going to judge him based on those 3 movies. But we have watched 4 of his films.
Yep.
And I feel like I've barely even gotten to know Clint.
We have watched less than 10% of his directorial output. And yet, here we are making a definitive statement on how good he is as a director.
Yep.
So let me set the scene here. Last season, we did a bonus episode called What Makes a Good Director? And we basically decided, hey, let's find a fun way to do what all artists hate and score out how good a director is based on some metrics. And then when we put them through a metric, we can tell how good they are. And so we went back and forth determining, like, what are the categories that you would judge just any director on their abilities? And we came up with a really interesting list. It's not what I necessarily would have thought would have been the 5 categories, but we shook out to Actually, Brad, why don't you give us our 5 categories? I don't have it pulled up here in front of me.
Yeah, so the categories that we have, and remember, all of these are nuanced by how the director influenced these areas. So performances, what kind of performances did the director draw out of his actors? Cinematography, when I look at the screen, what do I see on screen, and how did the director's choice affect all of that? Editing, this includes visual and audio. So the score for the movie, the sound effects, the things like that. And then you throw in there all of the visual things, the transitions from scene to scene. Then we talk about cohesion. How well do his movies work together within themselves? Do they have glaring holes? Are there issues that we had with maybe the plot or with the style of the movie? Like I'm thinking about Goodfellas, how the last few minutes of the movie feel stylistically so much different because, Henry is on cocaine. And then finally, we're talking about uniqueness. Within this director's era, how unique are his films? How much do they stand out among the crowd?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so those are our 5 categories: performances, cinematography, editing, cohesion, and uniqueness. Last season, what we started doing was we took each director that we did a mini series on and we put them through that metric. We released those episodes as bonus episodes exclusively to the patrons on our Patreon page. So if you'd like to hear those, you can go right on over to patreon.com/filmwhiskey and sign up at one of our 3 support tiers. However, this season, we're bringing them to the public. We're going to start with Eastwood, and we're going to put him through this metric based only on the 3 movies that we watched for him. So we're talking about Unforgiven, Mystic River, and Gran Torino. Brad, I don't think we really need to beat around the bush here anymore. Let's jump right in. And I think, unfortunately, the category that we're going to start with might be the one that he gets the weakest score in because it's performances. And this is really weighed down by the performances in Gran Torino, where the actual professional actors are given such bad dialogue that they are not doing a good job. And then everyone else in the movie who isn't named Clint Eastwood is not a professional actor. And so they're not good because they're not actors. And I hate to say it this way, but Mystic River had really great performances. Unforgiven, really great performances. But when it comes to Gran Torino, I think it really does kind of weigh down this score. I'm only going to give him a 7 out of 10 here on performances.
Yeah, I'm actually right below you at a 6.5. I think that the Schofield kid in Unforgiven was the roughest acting performance of that film. I think Mystic River was all around really solid. But outside of Sean Penn and Tim Robbins, I don't know if anybody really stood out to me in that film. So I think that's easily his best film from a acting performance standpoint. And then you get to Gran Torino, which kind of just tanks his score here. So unfortunately, I think we're off to a little bit of a rough start, but
yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. Well, hold on. Let me say this. I feel weird giving him a 7 or a 6.5 because it should be noted that in the 3 movies we watched, there are 3 Oscar-winning performances.
Yeah, that's true.
So it says something that 3 of the highest lauded performances of his directing career are balanced out by how bad we thought the performances were in Gran Torino.
Yeah. Well, also, if I'm being really blunt, the legend of Clint is that he doesn't give his actors any direction. And so I guess maybe it's hard for me to give him credit for Oscar wins in those categories. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, he still did direct them, technically, but
yeah.
I gotta say, too, I think we got 2 really, really great Eastwood performances in these 3 movies.
Yeah.
Between Unforgiven and Gran Torino, and then, you and I have recently, we rewatched $1 Million Baby as well, and I know that we're not considering that here, but just to see the level of nuance between those 3 characters and how he's doing variations on Clint, but they're not the same Clint, I think really does speak to how good of an actor he is, too. But again, our scores are our scores, and it's time for us to move into cinematography. Now, again, this is not just the shot composition, but how does Eastwood use the camera? How does he move the camera? How does he and his cinematographer use light and darkness and shadow and mood? And I think that this is really where Eastwood shines, because in Unforgiven, he's working with the language of the Western, the visual language of movies like The Searchers, which he's constantly calling back to. And then in a movie like Mystic River and Gran Torino, he's in his like $1 Million Baby phase where everything is almost black and white, desaturated, super strong shadows and mood lighting. And it really works. I think all three of these movies, the visual cues and the visual language of the movies work really, really well for the subject matter. I'm going to give him a 9 out of 10 here.
I'm with you. I'm at a 9 out of 10. I think that there's certain places in Unforgiven where it almost feels too bright. And it's almost like the cameras were too high quality to film a Western. Like when I think about Westerns, I don't think about high quality cameras. And so there was a little bit of a struggle there for me. But overall, I think that Clint does a really great job with the camera. And knowing how quickly he shoots his movies, it makes it almost more impressive to me that he's able to capture these images in such a way that he wants so quickly.
Okay, that takes us to editing. Now, again, we understand that Clint Eastwood is not the editor of these movies, but the director is ultimately responsible for how his or her movies hold together. We're going to get into cohesion as well here in a minute. But with editing, it's like what we see on screen, from the shots to the flow of the movie. And we're also factoring in things like sound. I think a lot of directors really rely on their ability to create soundscapes. Like a Christopher Nolan, you want to go watch a Nolan movie in theaters, not just because it's loud, but it's because the guy knows what he's doing when he's building soundscapes. He may not know how to make Bane sound intelligible, but the guy knows how to use the soundtrack. So with Clint Eastwood, it's a little scattershot, because I think Unforgiven is probably the strongest of the three when I think about how tightly constructed it is. Mystic River was a little bit shaggy, and Gran Torino had whole subplots that could have been removed. But what I will say is that I think he's very underrated in his use of sound. I thought that the sound in all three of these movies was surprisingly great. And I remembered these being like really small dramas, but they all had very good sound design, and you got to credit Clint with that a little bit. So I don't know, man, where are you coming out on this one?
I'm at an 8 out of 10. I think he does a pretty solid job the way he moves movies along with his editing. And I'm with you. I think his sound design overall is really solid. You also, though, have to take into account that he composes a lot of music for his movies. And I think it works really, really well in Unforgiven, and not so well, but not terrible in Mystic River. And then he sings at the end of Gran Torino. So that definitely bumped my score down a little bit. I might have been at an 8.5, but I'm sitting at an 8.
I'm going to give him an 8 as well. I think everything you said, I agree with, Brad. And that is a perfect segue into talking about the cohesion of his movies. How do these things hold together? It's kind of like when we give whiskeys a score and we talk about the overall balance. Did anything stand out in a positive or negative way? Or did it seem like a consistent experience across? Unforgiven, absolutely a consistent experience. Mystic River, a couple little bumps in the road, but overall very good. Gran Torino, I imagine that the potholed streets of Detroit are a good metaphor for the ride I went on in that movie. And so, yeah, man, this, once again, it's really hard, because it's like, I'm going to give you a 10 for Unforgiven. I'm going to give you like an 8.5 for Mystic River. I'm going to give you like a 6 for Gran Torino. I guess I'll shake out to a 7.5 here.
This is a really boring episode.
Are we in the same spot?
I'm in the exact same spot. 7.5. It like not as good as his editing. Gran Torino just, oh man, I feel bad for saying it, but it's really dragging down his ratings here, I think.
All right. And now it comes to uniqueness. And this is, I think, a place where a lot of people on the surface wouldn't say like, oh, Clint Eastwood is a super unique director, because he's pretty like No nonsense, no frills. I wouldn't call him the most artistic director. I wouldn't say that his shot compositions are always the best, especially like in Gran Torino. Like, it just kind of seems like there's a camera kind of floating around, but it's not always in the best place. However, you can't divorce the fact that Clint Eastwood is a movie star from who Clint Eastwood is as a director, because we've been saying it for weeks and weeks now. Almost every movie that we reviewed this season for him, and even taking $1 Million Baby into account from years ago on this podcast, is a commentary on Clint Eastwood's own stardom and the kinds of movies he used to make and the kinds of themes that he feels like he needs to correct or amend or give new thoughts on. And I think because of that, he makes these dark, brooding movies. And he's not the only person to make dark, brooding movies, but he's the only person that can make a movie like that where it has an automatic second layer built into it just because he made it. And I think because of that, he's an incredibly unique filmmaker. I'm going to give him a 10 out of 10 here.
I'll give him a 9.5 out of 10. I think that I'm with you in all those ways. And I think that what makes Clint such a unique director is kind of twofold. A, he just doesn't give a rip what anybody says about him. Like, I can't imagine that his poorly rated movies have any effect on him any more so than his highly rated movies does. But secondly, I think what really makes him unique is his ability to take stories and kind of turn them on their head. And the story that he continually turns on its head, and Bob, you're the one who pointed this out, so I'll give you the credit here. He continually questions why we are obsessed with violence and forces his movie watchers to reckon with what violence brings about in the world. And I think that all three of these movies do that in their own unique ways. And I just haven't seen many directors sit on that subject for a large part of their career. So I think he's a fantastically unique director.
All right, Brad, so that is bringing me out to a 41.5 out of 50 on Clint Eastwood as a director. What are you coming out to?
Just a point lower, 40.5.
All right, so that's taking us to an average of a 40 out of 50. It does feel really weird to like numerically score a director. It'd be like, he is exactly this good. Because again, like we're only dealing with 3 of his movies right now. But I think, you know, even considering the rocky relationship we have with Gran Torino, it says a lot about the guy that he's still coming out to a 40 out of 50 here.
Yeah, I think that Clint is truly one of the most fascinating directors I've watched in a long, long time. And I think it comes back to what you said, Bob. When you've lived in the movie world for this long, it only makes sense that you start to question all of the roles you portrayed earlier in life. And so I love Clint. I'm a little sad to see his score come out this low, Bob.
Yeah. Well, it is what it is, man. The metric does not lie, Brad.
It sure doesn't, man.
All right, Brad, it is time for us to sip a couple of whiskeys before we get over into this interview with Brett Boles. So let's crack open some Virginia Distillery Company. What do you say?
Let's get to it.
Hey, want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even make money. All in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Hey, even video podcasts are available on Spotify, and you can do cool things like Q&As and polls at the end of each of your episodes to get people interacting with you on Spotify. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. We've been using Spotify for Podcasters. Anchor has now rebranded into Spotify for Podcasters, so it's been totally integrated. It works perfectly, and we're distributed all over the world because of it. Try Spotify for Podcasters today.
All right, everybody. Today, we are going to be taking a look at the Virginia Distilling Company, specifically their lineup of 4 whiskeys under the Courage and Conviction. I wouldn't even call it brand. Like, it's just their lineup that's called Courage and Conviction.
That's right, Brad. Entering the canon famous pairs here. Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility,
yes,
Courage and Conviction. So yeah,
Oh, man.
Virginia Distillery Company is a distillery that we have not had on the show ever before, but I've seen their product all over the place. And I guess if you could say that they have two main lines of whiskey, one is this Courage and Conviction, which is carried, I think, a little bit further distribution-wise. And then the other one is a kind of specialty cask finished series that they call the VHW series. We have 2 samples of those whiskeys from the distillery that we will get to on a later bonus episode. But we figured, hey, we're drinking 4 whiskeys for you guys. Like, cut us some slack here,
Yeah, I will say, in the past, we have been sent, 5, 6, 7 samples from companies before, and we've drank them all in one sitting. And
nope. No more.
I think it gets to be a little too much for you guys to hear more than 3 or 4 whiskeys in a row. It also gets to be a little too much for us.
Yeah.
That's a lot of whiskey to drink.
I gotta go to bed, dude. Like this.
Exactly.
So Virginia Distillery Company's specialty is American Single Malt Whiskey, which is a category that is rapidly growing, but there are still only a few really big players in that vein. And I think our favorite to this point, Brad, has been McCarthy's out of Oregon, which was just stellar stuff.
I was going to say, and I think Old Line out of Maryland was a really good option that I enjoyed quite a bit.
I liked Old Line a lot, too. So, yeah, we've got 4 whiskeys here to drink. It's their baseline Courage and Conviction single malt whiskey, and then we've got the Courage and Conviction finished in bourbon casks, sherry casks, and Couvee casks. So we will get to all 3 of those, but Brad, we're going to start with this, just their standard Courage and Conviction. And let's dive right in, man. This is a 92 proof American single malt whiskey. What are you picking up on the nose?
Yeah, this is a very pleasant nose. For me, it's a strong malted barley opening. And the more I let it open up some, I get some butterscotch. There's some dark roast coffee notes. And then almost like some fresh, like evergreen fir sprigs.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
This has the brightness to it that Irish whiskey and most blended scotches that we drink have. And again, Brad, aside from bourbon, I think scotch is probably our most drunk expression of whiskey. And yet I still feel like you and I don't have the language down quite well enough yet when it comes to Scotch whiskey to describe. So forgive me if I'm comparing this. This is a single malt whiskey. I don't mean to compare it negatively to a blended whiskey. That's not at all what I mean. But when I think about something like the McCarthy's that we had that lives in that sort of, and that one was, I think, peated as well. It lives in that sort of like really high tier single malt scotch. This one is much more approachable. And I think it's probably intended to be that too. It's got the sort of floral and the melon that you get on some Highland scotches, but it's being made in America. I'm really, really excited to try this because those are like if I'm going to drink a scotch and it's not one that I intend to knock my, like blow me back in my seat with its peat, this is the kind that I like. So I'm really excited to see one made here in America. Let's give this a sip, man.
Yeah, as I got into the palate here, the barley really comes across strong, that malted barley flavor. For me, though, there was some fresh herbs that went along with it, and the longer I sat with it, it got some really nice vanilla notes. Overall, I don't think it was quite as complex as I was hoping it to be, though.
I actually was pleasantly surprised. I think I'm in a different spot than you on this one. This one had a level of sweetness that those, blended scotches and Irish whiskeys don't usually have. And it's not honey. It was vanilla and caramel. It had a very robust American whiskey palate to it with that really big, bold maltiness underneath. I will say that the char on this, the sort of smokiness you get is much closer to cigarette ash than it is peat. So if you're not ready for a really strong wood fire, burnt sensation, then you just need to be prepared for that on the finish here. But overall, I'm really impressed with this, honestly, Brad. And I'm excited to get into this bourbon finished one, which is the first of the 3 finishes we're doing.
Yeah, I think that the bourbon cask, for me, it had a very similar nose to the first one. but with like a caramel twist to it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair? Like, I don't want to be reductionistic, but it is extraordinarily similar. And then I'm like, oh, there's a little bit of brown sugar. There's kind of a caramely feel to it more than an actual nose.
Yeah, honestly, it's so similar that I'm not really picking up a lot of difference here. But I'm wondering if part of that is, this sounds stupid, but, you know, we talk about in wine, the idea of like terroir and how the land that you're getting the grapes from and where you're making the wine really affects the wine. And people have started talking about that in whiskey. And I kind of wonder if there's just something about making it in America that imparts that bourboniness to it, even though it's being made out of barley. I have no idea, man. I think it's going to present itself more on the taste, if anywhere, but the nose is extraordinarily similar.
Yeah, I think for me, the palate is where this one changed. It became a lot more creamy. You know, the barley came through strong, but there was caramel, there was vanilla, and then it almost turned cheesecake richness to me. That this one definitely was a step up from their first expression.
This is definitely, I think the two words you used, creamy and rich, are perfect for this. However, I think that it made the sweet notes stand out a little bit, but I lost the melon and I lost that like cigarette kind of ashy burn to it as well. So it rounded off the rough edges, but I think it's more a matter of like personal preference. Like, do you like something that has 3 or 4 really bold flavors back to back to back? Or do you like something that's like a little bit more well-rounded? I think I actually prefer the original to the Bourbon Cask, but I could see where you're liking that one better.
Yeah, I think it just came across, especially the creaminess came across to me as something I would just enjoy more.
Mm-hmm.
But that brings us over to our third expression, which is the Courage and Conviction finished in Sherry casks. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know if we said this, Bob, but all of these are clocking in at 46% ABV or 92 proof. Once again, on the nose here, for me, it was more of the same, maybe some cherry notes going on. But man, I like all three of these. I don't know. I don't want to sound mean, but they all smell kind of like the same whiskey to me.
Yeah, I feel that. I think that this one is just a tad closer. You know, like our very first ever sherry finished whiskey was Glenmorangie back in season 1.
Yeah.
Like This is a step even closer to a Highland Scotch. And in particular, I think it's that Glenmorangie La Santa from season 1. It's like, there's not a lot of grapiness on it, but it has a very classic sherry finished Scotch whiskey nose to it. And it's like, you know, if the first two Courage and Convictions were like 80% of the way to smelling exactly like those, this is 90% of the way to smelling like that. And again, I don't want to give the impression that it has to taste like or it has to smell like Scotch whiskey to be something on its own merits. Like, I don't want this to be exactly like Scotch whiskey, or else, like, why should it exist? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
what
are we doing here?
Right. So I do like that it is a little bit more in that wheelhouse, though, because I'm picking up some pretty subtle changes here.
Yeah, and when I got into the palate, it became much more tart for me. There was definitely some cherry, almost like a cherry cordial going on with a little bit of like dark chocolate. There were some fig notes in there. Once again, the barley comes through very strongly here. And so that's kind of where I was sitting at on the palate, Bob. What about you?
Yeah, I think that the influence of the sherry is way stronger on this one than the bourbon was on the bourbon finished one. Like, there is that sort of really, really dark grape note on this. Like, it's almost like, to me, it's almost more like a Pinot Noir than it is a sherry on this. It's not super tannic, but the sweetness has almost been completely absorbed by that sort of, I think fig is a good word for it, Brad, but for me, it was almost more pruny than anything else. I actually really like this, but it is for sure the most different one of the three that we've had so far.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the fourth one is a Couvee Cask, which I'll be honest with you, Bob, I don't know what Couvee is.
I think that's the shopping network that all of our grandparents. Is it QVC?
I was literally going to make that joke earlier.
Dad jokes galore on Film and Whiskey.
Nailed it.
All right, so as we get into nosing this cuvee finish, Brad, like for you, is it closer to the sherry finish? Is it closer to the bourbon finish, or is it its own thing?
I think it's much closer to the sherry cask. For me, I got like grapes, red berries, like all of those fruity notes for me, mixed with the malted barley. I will say when I sat with this one gave me the most unique note. It was almost like, you know, the little tin of Hershey's cocoa that like kids think is hot chocolate and it 100% is not.
Yes, yeah.
That, like, I got a note of that on this nose.
I like that.
Very interesting.
You know what? This I think does the best job of balancing everything that came before it. Like there is a super strong caramel note on this. Like it's vanilla, but it's definitely caramely, but it also has the most fruitiness to it, and the fruit is really bright. Like you mentioned berries. I do think like raspberry is something that I'm really getting pretty strongly on this. So it's almost like a more tart grape or raspberry kind of note to go along with that super bourbony caramel note. I like this a lot. I think this is the most complex nose of the four. What did you think of the taste, Brad?
I really liked it. This for me was my favorite of the four expressions. There was some raspberry. The vanilla turned stronger into almost like a vanilla bean flavor to mix with the malted barley. This was the first one I got that almost had a little bit of oakiness going on that I thought brought out some nice flavors. Overall, I think this one, it's not head and shoulders above the rest, but for me, it's the clear winner.
You know why I love you, Brad G? It's because
What's that, Robert Book?
It's because you and I are so wildly different as people. Because like this is. I mean, I'm drinking all four of these live. You drank them before we press record. I'm trying them as we talk about them. This one did not work for me at all, and like I think those like cigarette ashy notes came up pretty strongly towards the end, and like a very bitter grape note. However, this is the cool thing about experimental finishes, right? And like, you know, I have no idea if Virginia Distillery is going to be listening to this or not, but like, I don't think anyone there would be offended by me saying this is my least favorite of the four. It doesn't mean I think it's bad. It doesn't mean that I don't think anyone should drink it. And you've clearly said you think it's your favorite of the four. So like, this is what's cool about finishing whiskeys in different casks, about experimentation. I think if I was going to rank mine out, Brad, I would go sherry finish, original, bourbon, and cuvee. What would you do?
I think I would honestly go cuvee, bourbon, regular, sherry.
Of course. I think we're like complete opposites of each other. And I think 100%. That's a fantastic endorsement of this distillery. Like, I'm really looking forward to these two other samples that they sent us that we'll do, like I said, on a future bonus episode. But for now, I think what you need to know is that if you are in America, I don't know what their distribution outside the U.S. looks like. If you see Courage and Conviction on the shelf, it is like, for me, the number one thing I can say about it is that I respect so much that they're embracing the experimentation from expression to expression. I think that your best bet, like if you're going to go right down the middle, is to just buy the original version. But honestly, Brad, this makes me kind of nostalgic because it reminds me of that Glenmorangie sampler we did in season 1. Like, This is so similar to that in that the different finishes they're adding to their original kind of, baseline offering really do add so many complex layers to it. And it's like, wow, America gets one of these now. We have a single malt distiller that's doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, I was going to say Virginia Distillery Company, the Glenmorangie of America.
I'm sure they'll love getting sued by putting that slogan on things. All right, Brad, it is time for us to get over to our interview with the world famous TikToker. Do I sound old enough when I say TikToker?
Yeah, yes, you sound sufficiently old enough.
Let's get over to our interview with our friend Brett Boles. What do you say?
Let's get to it.
All right, everybody, we are joined by our new friend, and we're kind of fanboys of him,
A little bit, Bob.
Yeah. Brett Boles, who's known as the MT on TikTok and on your Instagram reels. I'm sure you've seen him if you're a follower of our podcast. Brett, how are you this evening?
I am terrific. How are you guys?
Oh, we're doing great. It's so nice to be able to like have a conversation with you and know that you have not like busted out the patented Brett Boles singing voice yet. I don't think I've ever interacted with any bit of you for more than 30 seconds without hearing that baritone you've got.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So if you're not familiar with Brett, he is a voice coach, a music teacher, and he's blowing up on our phones recently. He has, like I said, it's called the MT, where he breaks down music theory from some of your favorite shows, movies, I think Disney is kind of like where I've seen you camping out the most. I'm sure that gets you a lot of views, but I get a wave of nostalgia every time I see you dive deep into the music theory behind some of our favorite songs.
I don't think you're alone in that. One of the reasons I do a lot of Disney.
Yeah, I was going to say, for me, one of the first ones I remember seeing from you, Brett, was the Prince of Egypt discussing the plagues song. And that, it's one of the greatest musical songs ever written for an animated feature, in my opinion.
It's so good. It's strange, though. When I started covering that, I did that one 2 years ago, and I started it around Passover week, obviously. And, I've always loved that particular song, but that's not the one that I take away from the film. So I was surprised when so many people gravitate toward that song. I didn't realize how much of like a cult following like just that song has.
Yeah.
But it was pretty fascinating for me.
Which one sticks out for you?
I love Through Heaven's Eyes. That's my favorite. Yeah.
Yes, Brett. Yeah. I was going to say, we listened to that song with our daughters on repeat, and she just absolutely loves it. And I'm with you. If you are into the whole Christianity thing and religion, the theology in that song, it's one of the best written songs I think I've ever heard. But then on top of that, it's just absolutely beautiful.
Oh, it's gorgeous. And Brian Stokes Mitchell singing on it doesn't hurt it either. So.
Oh, yeah.
So followers of our podcast will know that Brad was stumping for us to get The Prince of Egypt on the show for years and years because it's one of his favorite movies. And me being a stickler, I was like, no, it needs to be classic films that we're reviewing. And then we did a season a couple years ago where we each just kind of picked 15 of our favorite movies, whether they were good or bad, movies that had some really deep memories for us. And so we watched The Prince of Egypt. And the thing I love about The Prince of Egypt, it kind of correlates with the movie that I picked for that season, which was The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And after The Lion King and through to the end of the decade in the 1990s, it seemed like studios went all in on not just, animated musicals, but in making them as intricate and maximalistic as possible. I've heard you talk a little bit about the Dies Irae in Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's kind of the same thing for me with Prince of Egypt. Like the orchestrations, the incredibly layered choral arrangements. It's like they reached their pinnacle with those two movies. And then after a couple of them didn't perform super well at the box office, it feels like the early 2000s are just kind of a wasteland for musicals from my childhood.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. It's interesting.
So Brett, let's go back a little bit. Let's talk about your history and how you got to this point. So I know you went to school for music theory, right?
I went to school for composition,
for
music composition at Ithaca, with an emphasis in musical theater. So I'm a musical theater writer. So that's really what I wanted to do, and I still do it. And the focus of my 4 years at school was to write a musical that would be produced by the theater department as a main stage musical, because no student had ever done that before. So I was like, I'm going to do this. And so I did, and we did an adaptation. I did an adaptation of The Count of Monte Cristo before Frank Wildhorn wrote his. And it was performed my senior year. And those of you who are musical theater people, if you know who Jeremy Jordan is, big name in musical theater, we went to school together. We were same year, and he actually starred in that show in college when we were in college together. You can actually find it on YouTube. If you look up my name or his name in The Count of Monte Cristo, you'll see some clips of us as babies doing that show during college.
Brett, I'm going to look that up. The Count of Monte Cristo is one of my favorite classic novels.
Oh, it's so good. It was my dad's
far.
favorite book, and he got me into it. I started writing it in high school and continued it all throughout college. So I did everything. I did book, music, lyrics, orchestrations. I did the whole thing.
Wow. That's pretty incredible. And I wish that, in the wave, like post Les Mis, that we had gotten more of those kind of classic literature adaptations for musical theater, because I'm like Brad said, I mean, that book is just, it's perfect for what we were going for in that era. Like, I wish that we'd gotten more like that.
I know, they're so expensive to produce,
Yeah, well, that's true too. So you get out of school, and for years and years and years, you are a vocal coach and a choir teacher. And I'm really interested to hear, the transition from like the day-to-day teaching teenagers to then living on the app that they are on constantly. Like, what's that transition like for you as an educator? Is it awkward for you? Is it awkward for them?
So, this is my 5th year teaching in public school. So before I started teaching in high school, I was doing private voice lessons, and I music directed shows locally and around whatever. But right around when the pandemic hit, the kids have been talking about TikTok a lot, and I'm notoriously terrible at anything social media related. Well, not anymore, but I used to be. And so we were home, and I was teaching my half-hour classes from my house. And I had that summer, there was nothing going on. I usually direct a show over the summer, and obviously none of that was happening. So right around winter break of that following year, I decided to give this a shot. And I thought, you know what, let me go and try to meet people where they are in terms of how songs are written and how songwriters think. And it turns out that I think I was uniquely positioned as a writer and as an educator and as a performer to kind of tackle this in a way that nobody else really had. And I thought, if I can just educate maybe 300 new people, I thought that would be great, and never thinking in a million years that it would blow up the way that it did. But if you look at the very beginning of my video feed, like the very beginning of it, the first week or two worth of videos, I had it set up so that like my ring light and my camera was in front of me looking at me, and I was sort of sitting at the keyboard, but you couldn't really see the piano. And ultimately I decided, and this was the teacher in me, that like maybe it would be better to place the camera to the side so you could sort of see the piano, and I could turn, and it would almost be like you were just sitting next to me and I was just talking to you like you were one of my students. And that's when things started to catch on. Mm-hmm. And I think it had a lot to do with the positioning of the camera and the style of which I was starting to do things. So that's my experience as a teacher. So I think it all sort of came together in this nice serendipitous way. And the thing took off.
No, it certainly did that. Brad, I don't mean to step on you, but I mean, it's grown to, I think you're at like 375,000 followers on TikTok now. I mean, did you ever imagine it getting to this point? And I mean, do you think it's more people responding to finding out new things about their favorite songs, or is it in some ways people having confirmed for them like why they loved these songs in the first place? Like the feedback that you get from people, what do you think it is that has made it catch on so much?
I think the comments that I get the most of are, I'm listening to music in a new way. It's like almost like I liken it to a sense that you never knew you always had. Mm-hmm. And you just sort of need somebody to break it down to you in language that you can understand. And my goal from the very beginning was to be able to reach anyone, regardless of their level of knowledge or experience. So I try not to use too much musical jargon because a lot of people don't understand that. And I try to break it down in ways that are really accessible. So I think people are hearing songs in ways that they never knew that they could. And that's exciting. And I think once you start to listen to songs that way, it's hard to stop and you want to. And I think you appreciate the craft more when you know what's going on. It's not like a magic trick where it spoils the trick if you know how it's done. It's one of those things that gives you a deeper appreciation for the songs that you know and love. So I think that's what people are reacting to.
Mm-hmm. I remember being really, really young and, watching movies and stuff. And at a certain point, I was probably like 7, 8, 9 years old. I realized that the music in movies wasn't just like a part of the movie. It was something that people played on instruments. Do you guys remember having that realization at some point in your childhood?
Yeah, like learning that a movie is all pretend and directed and that there's people in front of cameras. Yeah, the music's totally part of that. Yeah.
And I have a specific memory of realizing like, oh, the music, like I probably saw something on TV on like PBS or something of an orchestra playing a movie score and being like, oh, wow, this is a different part of it. And it feels like ever since then, I've slowly like dove deeper and deeper into like, it's not just like not a part of it. It's like a whole thing. And Brett, I feel like your pocket of the internet speaks to that process in such a way where people can move from, okay, I know that the music in the movie is made by people. Let's figure out more and more and more. And it's that educational side of it that makes people go, oh man, like I already love this music and now I get to learn more about it. Like that's awesome.
Yeah, well, you don't know what you don't know sometimes, and so when people realize that composers who write to film or for film are making conscious decisions about where they're placing notes, how they're constructing melodies and harmonic motion, and what instruments are playing what, and that there's a reason for all of those choices to, for lack of a better word, to manipulate your emotions. I mean, that's a cool thing to realize if you never really knew that or understood it, or maybe you knew that but didn't really understand how it all worked. And so it's just a really cool thing for people to learn, I think.
Absolutely. So I imagine that at this point you've had this question asked of you hundreds and hundreds of times, but people see you talking about specific pieces of music, specific songs on, Instagram Reels, TikTok, whatever. What would you suggest as like the baseline general rules for, okay, I've been watching Brett Boles. I want to apply this kind of thinking to all of the music that I take in my life, whether it's accompanying a movie or a TV show or whatever, if it's just something on the radio. What are your kind of general guidelines for people who are starting to develop that ear for interesting music theory or kind of compositional observations?
So I think it all comes down to prosody, right? And that's the thing that I talk about more than anything else is prosody, and that is how all the elements of a particular song or a piece of music work together to tell the same story. Mm-hmm. So in a musical, for example, you have lyrics and you have music, right? Those are the primary the primary pieces that come together to tell a story. And so, as a writer, as a songwriter, if you're constructing a song, you want to make sure that your music is helping the lyric tell whatever story the lyric is telling. So, on a very basic level, it can be something as simple as if the character is singing about looking up at the sky or something, that the music would probably be moving in some kind of upward trajectories to mirror that. It can be as simple as that. It can also be, now in the case of something like film music, for example, I did a whole thing about the beginning of the movie Up, the Disney Pixar film Up.
Yeah.
And now that gets more into harmonic structure, and Michael Giacchino, who does the same thing in Inside Out that he does in Up, and he bases everything on a major 7 chord. So that's a minor chord stacked on top of a major chord. So essentially it's a major chord and a minor chord together, which creates a sense of melancholy. Mm-hmm. Because on a very basic level, major chords are the quote unquote happy chords and minor chords are the quote unquote sad chords, even though it's a very, very, very basic explanation of it. But when you put those two things together, it creates this sense of melancholy. And so a lot of times when the ear is hearing something that's different from what the eye is seeing, it trips this wire in our brain and it makes us feel something. So as Mr. Fredrickson is going back into his house after Ellie dies, we hear this alternate, all these alternate chords playing. It's an F major 7 and then an F major and an F major 7 and an F major. And you're wondering, like, where is it going to land, right? We have this really melancholy chord followed by what we normally would think of as a happy chord, but something really sad has just happened. And when he closes the door and goes back into the house, the very last thing we hear is it settles on an F major chord. And it just does something to you inside. It like makes you well up with tears, and it tugs at your heartstrings because what you're seeing and what you're hearing are not the same thing. So you have this cognitive dissonance going on, and it's a really powerful thing to use in film music.
I love it. I can sit here and listen to this all day. I think maybe the best application of it is if we talk about a specific movie. And Brett, as you and I were kind of going back and forth through email, we settled on talking about what is, I mean, still a couple years after its release, definitely the most popular current Disney musical, and that is Encanto, a movie that has just infected my home with unending music for 2.5 years now, to the point where, like, I'm putting my kids to bed and we're listening to Encanto lullabies. It's not any other kind of lullabies, specifically Encanto. And I have a very interesting relationship with this movie because when Disney released the filmed version of Hamilton in 2020, it hit me in such a way that with Hamilton, it was one of those things where I recognize it almost immediately as the kind of work of art that only comes around every like 10, 15 years that is like so intricate and so dense and just a text that you can return to time and time and time again and find new meanings in and levels of music theory and everything else. And then when I saw
listening to that, I'm
listening to Encanto. Well, I'm saying, night. So then, Lin-Manuel Miranda does Encanto. And I remember walking out of Encanto and being like a little bit let down. And I couldn't place why I felt so let down by Encanto. And the more I've watched it, because I have been forced to watch it, I've realized I think the movie would have been much better served, Brad, if Lin-Manuel Miranda had been given free rein to do the entire thing in that sort of opera style that he did Hamilton. I wish there was no dialogue in that movie. I wish there were no breaks from the music, because even if you just listen to the Encanto soundtrack, every single thing that the actual, on Broadway, they would call it the book. Everything that the book, the libretto, would tell you, Lin-Manuel Miranda has already done either in the lyrics or in the musical themes of the music itself. I think the redundancy of it is what got to me.
That's interesting.
Brad, you've seen Encanto, right?
I have seen Encanto, yeah.
What are your general thoughts on Encanto?
I thought that it was a solid, like, B- animated musical. Okay. I think that the music overall was really fun and engaging. I think the animation style was very bright, and I feel like that's been missing. The story was a lot better than a lot of other Disney stuff lately. So overall, I enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty good.
So Brett, when Encanto first came across your radar, I mean, like, how do you tackle something like a Lin-Manuel Miranda production?
Well, so Lin is extremely knowledgeable about his craft and very deliberate, in a lot of ways, more deliberate than many other writers even are, about his choices and the choices that he makes. And so when it comes to him, I like to focus on little moments as opposed to taking a macroscopic view at first and just kind of like delight in the little things that he does. This actually, Encanto, one of my Encanto videos is what got Lin to follow me on Instagram. And it was that song, What Else Can I Do? That Isabel sings. And Isabella, yeah. Isabella, yeah. And there's the opening phrase, and one of the opening phrases of that song, there's a 4-measure phrase followed by a 5-measure phrase. And it happens right around the words, it's not symmetrical or perfect, but it's beautiful and it's mine. And it's a very deliberate choice that he made to do that 4-measure phrase followed by the 5-measure phrase, because again, that's prosody. That's the music and the structure of the music supporting the story of the lyric, right? And that's the video that he shared on his story and said, quit giving away my secrets, Brett. So which was very cool. But that it's just those kinds of choices that he makes are so fun to delight in and share with people, because you're not going to hear that. Most people aren't going to hear that on first listen. And admittedly, I don't hear a lot of that stuff on first listen. It takes me looking at the score and going into it to learn all this stuff. So one of the other reasons I love doing all these videos is because I'm learning at the same time everybody else is. I don't always pick up on this stuff on first listen. I sometimes have to look at it, and only through looking at it do I realize, oh my God, that's so cool.
I want to talk real quick about like one of my favorite moments, because I went back and listened again to the Encanto soundtrack just to prepare for this. And one of my very favorite moments, and it's something that like Brett's going to be like, yeah, of course. But I love in the first song in the movie, the Family Madrigal, where Maribel is introducing the whole family. And it follows a very particular rhythm, a very particular pattern, and a very particular melody until they get to Abuela. And then the melody that she sings is, you know, we swear to always help those around us. And it's the melody of a song that comes later on. You know, it's a foreshadowing of a song that comes later on in the movie called Dos Oruguitas. And we've already gotten a hint of it in the movie because in the opening scene, we see her husband get slaughtered and the kind of birth of the miracle that is protecting this family. But what I love that they do in that song by allowing her to kind of give a little bit of that foreshadowing through that melody is it's such an early window into her psychology and what's driving her. And it's not just that she's hard on the family. It's not just that she's forcing them to live up to a standard. It's that when we revisit that melody later on in the movie, in that scene, Dos Oruguitas, it is, I mean, it's heart-wrenching because you're finally seeing it from her perspective and you're seeing what she had to go through and the grief and loss that she's still processing. And then to go back to the Family Madrigal where she's talking about work and dedication will keep the miracle burning, you know, and each new generation must keep the miracle burning. It's so like, Brad, I don't know. We've talked about, you know, the therapy elements of that movie before and how everybody needs to be in it in that movie. But to get all of what becomes explicit kind of folded in that lovely little way early on in the movie, it really softens the character of Abuela for me. And I think it's just like, it's a nice little trail of breadcrumbs that you get from the beginning of the movie into that emotional climax later on.
It's also really cool that in that moment, it shows and illustrates how far apart Abuela and Mirabel are from each other, right? And it's also that same song that brings them then together at the end. So it serves the purpose of illustrating the two extreme ends of their relationship too, which is really cool.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, part of the beauty of learning is not just the initial learning, it's the teaching it to other people. Because like, I know people have said this before, but you don't truly learn something until you have taught it to someone else. And that like really helps it sink in. And I think we can see that in your videos over the years, Brett, because, you know, at the start you are teaching it at a high level, but it feels like as we've moved on and you've done thousands of videos now, it's like your knowledge of all these has deepened just because you've been teaching it so much. And that's just been really cool to watch.
Yeah. That's it. As a teacher, I love learning just as much as I love teaching, and they both go hand in hand. And this has been not only a teaching experience for me, but a learning experience for me. So yeah, it's been awesome.
All right, Brett, before we let you go, I mean, we brought you onto the Film and Whiskey podcast. We can't not talk about movies for like a majority of the time we're here. So stepping out of the world of Encanto, I know you've hinted at some other movie-related series that you've done on your channel, but is there any movie score or song from a movie that you really hope to dive into? Like, is there anything that you'd like to do like a really deep dive on over an extended series of movies, or just things that you're like, man, I hope someday I get a chance to do that score?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, I've done a few Lord of the Rings things, and I've done a few Star Wars things. I would really love to dig into both of those things even more than I have, just because there's so much there. Yeah. I mean, Howard Shore and John Williams are both just absolute masters of the craft. But people have also been asking for some of the older like Enrico Morricone films. So yeah. So I may like Cinema Paradiso and those kinds of things. It may be really cool to kind of go back and look at some of those too, because I haven't done a whole lot of that. Yeah. So that might be really neat.
Sometimes I go back and just listen to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it might just be the best soundtrack ever written. It is such an incredible piece of composition from start to finish. So yeah, that I'm there all day for that, Brett.
Yeah, I think that may be some of the next film things that I may go back.
Although if you dedicated like a month of your show, if you will, to Lord of the Rings, I don't think anybody would complain.
Probably not. Probably not. Those films are just exquisite. Oh my God, the music in those films is so good.
So one of the things we like to do before we let a guest go is we put them on the hot seat and we run them through a questionnaire. I'll tell you what, Brett, we're going to let you off a little bit easy, but I do have a one burning question, and you have to answer immediately as soon as I ask it. No thinking about this. What is the best John Williams score?
Star Wars.
Oh, there you go, Brett.
Let's go.
I was really hoping we get an ET plug here.
Bob, go home.
Yeah,
ET.
I know.
All right.
I mean, ET, that main theme from ET is great.
I was going to say, John Williams is the only good thing from ET.
Oh, man. I didn't think we'd devolve into this. All right, everybody, Brett. This has been Brett Boles. I cannot tell you, Brett, first of all, how thankful we are that you sat down with us for a little bit so that we could tell you. I mean, it's been a long time since I was in choir, and I look for those kind of musical outlets and those chances to converse with people about really getting intricate with what the music's about. And I feel like I get to have that conversation with you every time I'm watching your videos. So first of all, thank you for that. But we want to give you an opportunity to plug anything that you have coming up, anything that, you know, you can tantalize us with a little bit, because you're a very busy guy and you're doing big things now.
Starting to, yeah, I've got some things planned. I do have a few courses that are going to be coming out soon. I'm starting with a lyric writing course, so that's going to be available starting next month. And shortly after that, I'll be going into a music writing course, all sort of tying into songwriting in general. So you can be on the lookout for that. And then I also have, I can't announce officially the place where I'm doing this yet, but I'll be doing a live version of what I do on Instagram and TikTok in New York in September. So I have that coming up as well.
Oh, that's exciting. All right, Brett, where can people find you?
I am on TikTok at Brett Boles, and then Instagram at the Brett Boles. Those are my two things. And then YouTube also at Brett Boles. I'm also on YouTube.
Well, Brett, we wish you the very best as the school year winds down and in all of your future endeavors. I'm already excited for September. I don't even know what it's about yet, but I've got it marked on my calendar now. September is Brett Boles month. So, all right, Brett, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's been a blast.
All right, so that was Brett Boles, a fantastic interview guest. Brad, I was
guy.
Super impressed with how chill he was as we interviewed him, because if you've seen his reels or his TikToks, like, he's a very high energy music teacher. But we interviewed him at 8 p.m. And like most teachers, not only was his energy like gone for the day, but I've realized that most of the teachers in my life are introverts. I have no idea if Brett's an introvert, but like, it was so cool to just see him be like, yeah, man, like whatever you guys want to do, like we'll do that.
Yeah.
It was really, really cool.
Yeah.
I can't wait to have him back on the show again.
Yeah, really an incredible guest, and somebody that I feel like he would just be a lot of fun to just chill with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, and there's not a lot of people that you get to do that with. So, Brett, thank you for coming on the show, man. It was great to have you.
All right, we will be back on Tuesday with another regularly scheduled episode. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.